We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. I'm Eric Senich. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website, bookedonrock.com. Our guest is Fred Goodman. He has a brand new book out now titled Rock on Film, The Movies That Rocked the Big Screen. It's in association with Turner Classic Movies. When the use of Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock turned 1955's Blackboard Jungle into a teen sensation and a box office smash, it proved the opening shot in a cinematic and cultural revolution. Starting with Elvis Presley and the teensploitation films of the 50s and 60s, in Rock on Film, award-winning author and former Rolling Stone editor Fred Goodman takes readers on a wide-ranging journey through film and pop history. Along the way, he measures the transformative impact of the mid-60s landmarks A Hard Day's Night and Don't Look Back, and how they seeded an almost unbelievably broad genre of films made by increasingly ambitious musicians and filmmakers across the past 7 decades. From the carefree to the complex, the mindless to the mind-bending, rock films have staked out their own turf by simultaneously celebrating innocence and challenging artistic and social conventions. With an insightful roundup of 50 must-see rock films spanning crowd pleasers, art house favorites, underground gems, and undisputed classics, Rock on Film surveys the nearly 70-year canon of a genre like no other. A series of original interviews with Cameron Crowe, Jim Jarmusch, Penelope Spheris, Taylor Hackford, and John Waters illuminates how rock has influenced the work of some of the most divergent and thoughtful directors in movie history. Illustrated throughout by more than 150 full-color and black and white images, Rock on Film brings the history of music in the movies to vivid life. Fred Goodman is a former editor at Rolling Stone, whose work has appeared in the New York Times and many other publications. His previous books include the award-winning The Mansion on the Hill, Dylan, Young, Geffen, Springsteen, and the Head-On Collision of Rock and Commerce, and Why Lhasa de Sela Matters. He joins us from his home in New York. To hear a playlist of the artist and the music discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Fred, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Eric. Thank you for inviting me.
Before I ask you about what's inside the book, how does Turner Classic Movies become a part of this project? They sanction the book?
Turner has its series of books that it does, and they're administered by a company called Running Press, which is part of the Hachette Publishing Group. And they specialize in a lot of different things, and one of the things they do is really nice graphic books, so they're a good home for Turner. So things like, the Essentials books and Eddie Muller's books on film noir, and a bunch of other things have all been done by this publisher, Running Press. And I had been a music editor at Rolling Stone, and I thought for years, I couldn't believe that there wasn't an up-to-date rock film book. I think the last one was Marshall Crenshaw did one about 25 or 30 years ago. And that's been out of print for a long time. And in fact, even before that, there was another book called Rock on Film that had Elvis Presley on a motorcycle on the cover. And those were sort of the two, but neither one of them has been in print for a very long time. And obviously a lot has happened. So when I wanted to do a book like this, I thought, probably the best place for it is the Turner Classics book series. And in fact, that turned out to be a really good match because, as you know, there's a lot of photographs. There's over 150 photos and posters in this book. And if you were doing that on your own, it would be prohibitive. You could never pay to have a book that graphically complete. So having them on, with their connections made it possible to do the book that we have.
And you said you were on the network recently to talk about the book, and I know every Monday they were playing movies, rock and roll movies, right? And you were there.
Well, the book came out, they were very kind, in fact, because originally we were going to put the book out in August, and they said, if you could put out in July, we have a slate of films, rock and roll films, and we'll start promoting the book right away, and you can come on and talk about it. And it was great. I was able to go on and introduce 3 movies with Dave Karger, which was really lovely.
Outstanding. That is my hands-down favorite television network. There's not even a close second, to be honest with you.
Well, it's a wonderful thing, and what I was really addicted to, they a couple of years ago, they had a pay-per-view outlet with Criterion called Filmstruck, which was my idea of what I'd been waiting for all the time on the internet. So I'm a huge Turner fan. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. And they clean up all the film. No commercials. I mean, I was telling you before we started recording that the fact that Turner Classics is part of this, it just makes this interview that much more special for me, because my dad sadly just passed away and he had dementia. And so as the years went on, he said less and less. So the conversations really weren't there anymore. I'd come in and visit him and we would just hang out. Among the many things we had in common was Turner Classic Movies. He used to call me and say, "Eric, Hitchcock's on. Rear Window's on. Oh, we got to turn it on." And we loved talking Turner Classics and always did. So by the end, I knew that I could at least hit that power button on the remote. And we always had it so it was set on 162 for Turner Classic Movies. And we would just sit and watch for 2 hours. And I would just pull up the trivia and I'd say, "Oh, Dad, this was filmed in, this one was filmed in Nebraska." And he'd go, "Oh, yeah." And then every now and then I'd say, "Who are these actors?" And he'd nail them, one, 2, and 3. So, wow, I never thought Turner Classics would be somehow part of this podcast, because it's strictly a rock and roll podcast, books on rock. But here you go. There are so many great movies that tie in with rock and roll. So I want to start for you where it started. Can you talk about seeing the 1971 Frank Zappa film 200 Motels? You write about it in the book. Was this the first time you saw Hollywood and rock and roll merging together on the big screen?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, no, not really, because of course, Woodstock, was around the same time, and you would see things, if you were lucky enough to see something like the Tammy Show, earlier. And of course, there had been the Beach movies, which I didn't, I saw maybe at drive-ins or on television as a kid and that sort of thing. But, I tell a story at the beginning of the book. I had a job when I was in high school working in the kitchen of a summer camp up in the Pocono Mountains. And we were right across the border from New York. And back then, Pennsylvania was a 21 state and New York was an 18 state. So we all would go over the border all the time and go to the bars, even though we weren't 18, but, we could get away with it. But also in this town was a little tiny theater called the Capitol. And I grew up in the suburbs and I had never seen anything like this. I mean, this was an old wood-fronted movie theater, like in a row of wooden buildings on Main Street of a upstate Catskill, New York town. And it was even the back of it was on the Delaware River. And it was a little tiny place. I don't think it had more than 6 or 7 rows. And in fact, they couldn't show the same film for a whole week. The population was so small that they would print up schedules, and maybe a film would be in town for 2 or 3 nights. And lo and behold, one night at this little tiny theater in the middle of nowhere in the Catskills, they were showing 200 Motels by Frank Zappa. So a bunch of us, after we finished working in the kitchen, we didn't even change. We went in our white kitchen uniforms and stinking of food and, our feet are all wet from mopping the floor, but we went over there and we wanted to see what this film was. Now, you get into this theater and we're the only ones in there, like 4 teenagers dressed in kitchen uniforms, and there's about 5 or 6 local adults sitting around, men who couldn't possibly know who Frank Zappa was. I mean, they're either there because there's nothing going on or because they think 200 Motels might be maybe a blue movie,
Yeah.
So have you seen the film?
I was just going to say, I've never seen it. I heard it's really out there, out there.
Really out there. I mean, it's almost impossible to follow. And it's full of psychedelic stuff. And it's full of weird castings and inside jokes. And I turned around 10 minutes into the film and these other local guys who were there, they were all gone. It was just the 4 of us sitting there trying to make sense of what it was, what Frank Zappa's film was about. And I'm not sure we ever did, but we sure talked about it a lot, which is kind of what it is. It becomes a dialogue. Someone is putting forth this sort of idea of how rock and movies might go together and expand on each other. And that was really exciting, So even though the film was like a head scratcher, It was a great experience.
And as you know, the idea of rock and roll and film coming together didn't start in 1970 or 71. We go back to the mid-50s.
Right. Yep.
The use of the Bill Haley and his Comet song Rock Around the Clock in the 1955 film Blackboard Jungle really gave that movie a boost. And it, as you write, marked the first time Hollywood took notice of rock's growing appeal. But it was 1956's Rock Around the Clock featuring Haley and his band that is considered the first quote-unquote rock and roll film.
Rock and roll movie, yeah. And then also, you get things like The Girl Can't Help It, which is another one of these Hollywood hybrids with Jane Mansfield. And it doesn't really have much of a rock and roll mindset to it. I mean, it really doesn't know what to make of rock and roll, except it has amazing performances in it by, people like Little Richard and Fats Domino and Eddie Cochran. And so it's the first time, that you're seeing these multiple artists. And there's a lot of films like that. I mean, there were numerous films with Alan Freed, like that, about 3 or 4 of them, and he always played himself. And he was mostly introducing acts, and the plots were thin. And that's really what it is up until the mid-'60s. You get films like that. You get the beach party films from American International, with Annette Funicello and Fabian and that kind of stuff. But it really isn't until the beginning of the 60s, Beatlemania has a big part of it. The Beatles did a closed circuit version of their first American concert in Washington, D.C. And they had an early technology with a producer where they sent it over the phone lines to theaters around the country. And it was a one-night deal that made $4 million, which was real money, in 1963.
Yeah.
So everybody was very impressed by that. I think Leslie Gore and the Beach Boys performances of them were also included in this package. And that led to things like The Tammy Show and The Big TNT Show and these early performance films, which when you watch them, you see are really sort of based on what television did. They were directed by TV directors. So like the guy, who directed Steve Binder, who directed the Tammy Show, worked on Hullabaloo. So when you watch that, it's like watching what Hullabaloo looked like on television. They're on risers, they're in go-go dancers. It's very similar. And it isn't really until you start getting the festival films, Monterey Pop, Woodstock, that changes and the performance style really kind of explodes in other directions.
That's interesting. It's kind of like the history of MTV. When it starts, it's very basic. Let's just put out there what we can do with what we have, and then over time it becomes an art form. And you got guys who go on to make movies that are making videos. Well,
it's fascinating. I mean, it is similar because what happens is people show that there's a venue that can be used, right? I mean, these early music videos, they were, as far as I can tell, basically a way to save money for the record companies. Why should we send the band all over the country or all around the world to do a promotional tour? Let's make a movie with them where they're performing the first single, off the album. And that was the way the videos started. And then there were enough of them that someone like MTV came along and saw that there could be programming built around this. And then suddenly it really takes off. Like you say, when they start, they can only show what they have. But once MTV exists, the record companies start pouring money into this and creating videos because there's an outlet.
Yeah, it becomes an art form. I want to go back to Alan Freed. As a longtime FM rock disc jockey, I was so interested in finding out the history of the disc jockey, and the name Alan Freed was one I became familiar with early on. He was the guy who popularized the phrase rock and roll in the early 50s. He produced these incredibly popular concerts. And as you said, he appeared in several of those early rock and roll films: Rock Around the Clock, Don't Knock the Rock, Mr. Rock and Roll, and Go Johnny Go. I'm curious as to how he ends up in so many films. Did the studios feel they could bring the young audiences to theaters knowing he'd be in it? Or was it one of those things like a package deal? Like, if you want these musicians in the movie, you got to put me in there too.
Well, I think Freed was a bit of a power broker. I mean, he got his name on, early Chuck Berry records, as a co-writer, because that was the way it worked back then. That's how payola worked, and it wasn't illegal at the time. So, I think he was a bit of a power broker. And I think also his name was associated with this thing. I don't know specifically how those films came to be made. So I don't know whether it's a question of Freed bringing them to them or a producer hooking up with Freed, but clearly they're functional. The plots are always kind of razor thin. And it's really all about the performances. How many artists can we get in this film, and are they the right ones?
Yeah, he himself was stiff, a little plastic. He's just there. It's not easy to act.
But it's interesting. This is this amazing bit in Go Johnny Go, where Chuck Berry performs Little Queenie, right? And the band includes Freed on drums, and Dave Brubeck is the piano player.
Oh.
And it's like totally bizarre.
Wow. Yeah. I wondered. I mean, I always thought to myself, there's no way that Alan had to audition for these movies because it's not, he's
playing Alan Freed.
Right.
That's all he ever does in these movies is play Alan Freed.
I want to go back to Blackboard Jungle. Can you talk about why Blackboard Jungle faced bans in some places? For the younger audience listening right now, this may seem hard to believe, but there were those who actually feared rock and roll would contribute to the demise of segregation.
Well, and to juvenile delinquency. And, it was sort of a bugaboo of fundamentalists and hard right in the United States. But also, it caused a stir in the movie theaters. It made headlines. There were, quote unquote, riots in the theater because, when Bill Haley singing Rock Around the Clock would come on at Blackboard Jungle, kids would get up on the seats and start dancing and jumping around. And, this was like no one had really seen this in movie theaters. So there were all sorts of stories about, riots in New York and riots in London, all of which, of course, fueled the theater. I know that when the film came to Liverpool, I know that John Lennon and Paul McCartney were both like, teenagers who ran down to see it. It was that sort of thing. If it was what you loved, this was like big news.
There was some danger in it. That's what rock and roll really has been based on since it started.
Well, I think it certainly was. But of course, you're going to get into that when you start talking about Elvis Presley's career, because, the first thing that happens is they take the danger out of Elvis, and you can decide, if this is a good thing or a bad thing, or you like it, or it doesn't matter to you, or what have you. But, yes, it's true. There was a certain pressure against showing these films. And, in some places you would get community leaders and politicians and religious groups, talking against rock and roll and saying this stuff shouldn't be brought, to the movie theaters. And one of the things was, of course, it was a black-based music. So there was this sort of fear of miscegenation, of middle-class values being undercut, by black culture. It would be the polite way of saying it.
But all it did was get the kids more interested. They wanted to go see it. You tell a kid not to do something, they're going to do it.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the movies is part of it, but the movies is picking up something that's already happening. I remember, I used to know Jerry Wexler, who was a partner in Atlantic Records and produced Aretha Franklin most famously and many, many other people. And I remember saying to him, so where do you think rock and roll really starts? I mean, you guys are there right at the beginning when it's R&B and then it becomes rock and roll. I said, what did it? He goes, kids with transistor radios at the beach where you would hear these black records, and they would be playing and, kids would be reacting to it. I mean, of course, that's a sort of romantic picture of it. But, how many times have you read interviews with rock and rollers who talk about listening to the Hound Dog out of Buffalo or listening to the, station out of Memphis with 50,000 watts, or whatever it was, guys, are hearing this sound that they haven't heard.
The British bands with pirate radio.
Yes. And it finds its audience, that way.
The great Chuck Berry, he's in the film Go Johnny Go. You call him, quote, the indispensable innovator who laid down the rules and executed them with as much humanity and brilliance as anyone ever will. He is the architect of every house erected in the shadow of his musical mansion. Did he ever talk about his experience on the set of those films in later years? How much difficulty did he have on the set with those who weren't fond of a black man on set, let alone a star in the film?
I don't recall seeing him talking about this stuff at all. I think it was, sort of a payday, and the films were made fast and dirty, and he was happy to have them. I don't think he thought of himself as a movie star. I think he thought of it as another gig. He was an incredibly complicated human being. He was a brilliant guy, as you so nicely quote my feelings about him. And I say even that, you can't even compare him to another rock and roller. I mean, if you want to compare him to anybody, you have to compare him to like what Anton Chekhov did for the short story. He's the guy who makes it modern. And that's what Chuck Berry is in rock and roll. He's like that. But there are some ways, if you watch especially Taylor Hackford's incredible movie, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, the Chuck Berry biography film and the performance film, he's such a contradictory, complicated person. He's just maddening in the movie. He's like trying to undercut this movie. He's driving the director crazy. Keith Richards is there, as the band director, because he's like the number one acolyte of Chuck Berry. And Chuck Berry is trying to make his life miserable.
That scene where he accused Keith of, oh no, you said don't touch my guitar, right? Don't touch or my amp. I think was it the guitar or the amp?
You're very touchy about everything. I mean, clearly, if you want to go left, Chuck's going to go right. Not because it's better, but because you want to go left. Is the feeling that starts coming out in this film, and it's a very, very strange dynamic. He was a man, who'd been through a lot. He had been arrested as a kid for stealing a car, and went to jail for that. And then later on had, some sort of infamous problems with the law, including, a Mann Act violation, which is just a terrible thing to be charged with and was an abused sort of law. So, and then he had all sorts of weird quirks and was a loner, a real lone wolf.
In his defense, later years, the story was out that he would carry his own suitcase or briefcase with him with the money in it, and he demanded the money up front. He'd go to the gig and say, "You're paying."
That's in the movie.
It's in the. And
there's a scene of that. When I talked to Taylor Hackford about making this movie, it was a 6-day shoot, right, to make Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll. And Chuck is on as an associate producer, and for his involvement in the film, he's paid $500,000, which means you're the associate producer and you have to be here for the 6 days of the shoot, including the concert. And he goes, great. And he said 2 days into the shoot, he informs me he's not going to be there the next day because he has to go to Ohio to play a show for $30,000. And he would not do it. So Hackford did the only thing he could, which was he sent a sound man and a cameraman with him. And he followed Chuck, drives himself to the airport with that suitcase of money and his guitar, gets on the plane, gets off the plane, goes to the hall, meets his band as he's going on stage. You have to supply local musicians to play with because everybody knows what's a Chuck Berry tune. It's a 1-4-5 and let's go. Then he gets his money and goes home. And they capture all of that. And what's so nice is then they have Bruce Springsteen in the film talking about the night that he was that musician. He and like his backup band, before they were famous, the guys he played with, did one of these Chuck Berry pickup dates.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
That's amazing. But Chuck Berry had to have gotten ripped off so many times. Again, in his defense, you can imagine some of the racist club owners just saying, "Yeah, kid,
you listen. I wouldn't, to psychoanalyze this guy, to say what he's been through. It's not for me to say. But he certainly turned out to be a man who, on some level, did not appreciate his own genius. Here's this guy who's probably one of the greatest songwriters ever. And you get the sense very often watching this film that it means little more to him than a lucrative hustle, that he doesn't recognize his own brilliance and how unique he is and how great he is.
Yeah. Taylor also worked with Phil Spector, and he's another one. Spector provided the music for the 1980 film The Idolmaker.
Or was supposed to.
And Taylor told you a funny story about an urn.
What happened was he locked Taylor in his house and wouldn't let him out. And Taylor said, listen, if you don't let me out, I'm going to throw this urn through the window. but, basically what I think happened was that, everything was great until Spector had to deliver. And then he had never done the music for whatever reasons and was stalling. And Hackford had to get started. So what he wound up doing was, hiring, I think, Jeff Barry, who did all the music in a week for The Idolmaker. Taylor he's a rock and roll guy. I mean, the book has a couple of interviews with directors, and Taylor is one of the directors that I interviewed. And aside from doing, The Idolmaker, as you mentioned, which is a a fictionalized version of the guy who had created Fabian and some of these other sort of faux rockers. But he also produced La Bamba, the movie about Richie Valens.
Oh, yeah.
And he directed Ray, about Ray Charles. And it's fascinating to talk to him about it. And, we go into it in some length in the interview. It took him 15 years to get the Ray Charles movie made. Now, I mean, here's a director who has a tremendous CV. He did An Officer and a Gentleman and, Against All Odds. And he's had hits, and it took him 15 years to find the money to make a biography of Ray Charles. And I said, why? And he goes, his age. It's not the demographic that Hollywood thinks of. He's black, he's older, and he said, amazingly, Ray stuck with me through all that time until we did get the funding to make the movie.
And Jamie Foxx is amazing in that film.
Well, and he said that was sort of the happy ending of having to take 15 years, right? He says, because if we'd gotten funding right away, it never would have been Jamie. He would have been a kid.
Yeah. Did he have any actors in mind? Did he tell you?
We never talked about that. I'm sure he would have at certain points. But I mean, Jamie Foxx is so great. It's eerie. I mean, it's like you can't believe you're not watching Ray Charles.
Yeah.
I know Jamie did a lot. He had prosthetics made that made him blind. And he literally wore them up to 18 hours a day on the set.
Yeah, that's what do they call that? That's the Marlon Brando approach.
That's right.
Living the character 24/7. Method acting,
right.
Living the character 24/7. Yeah. Elvis Presley made Love Me Tender in 1956. Then he goes on to be in 30 more feature films. He was frustrated with his career in film, though. He wanted to be a Marlon Brando level actor. Instead, his films were more of a vehicle for his music, and he was, as you write, a middle-of-the-pack matinee idol. That as a result of never getting the opportunity to really prove himself as an actor, thanks to his manager, Colonel Parker, mostly. If he was given that opportunity, could he have been a great actor, a good actor?
I think he could have. I mean, there were interviews with directors who worked with him, like Philip Dune, who said that, Elvis could really act. And I think you see it also in Jailhouse Rock, even though people who didn't like Elvis and didn't like Elvis Presley movies reviewing it made fun of him. There's nothing to make fun of. When he's got something to do, he does it. The problem is, they make him into somebody, if you're a rock and roll fan, it's like the Elvis you want to see is that guy who came out of Memphis, who's a little bit dangerous. And you don't get that in It Happened at the World's Fair, or Harem Scarum, or the vast majority of these films. He's just kind of a nice guy.
Was it true that Elvis was offered the role in A Star Is Born just before he passed away, or a few years before that?
I don't know anything about that. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, because in the movie,
which version would it be? Would it be the Barbra Streisand one?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I got to tell you, Chris Christopherson, I think, is sort of the high point of that film. I mean, he's really well cast, and I think he's working valiantly to make that film watchable.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think that's not a good film. That's why I was so surprised, to see the more recent one with Lady Gaga. I mean, it's really a good movie,
Yeah.
And if you had watched the Streisand one, you would think, well, it's not really a pop and rock vehicle. It's a movie star story. But they did it. They did a wonderful job.
Yeah. Well, the story is that Barbra Streisand wanted Elvis. That was her first choice. So you wonder how that could have changed Elvis's career if he had made that movie.
I don't think that movie would have been good under any circumstances. I don't know that Elvis, I mean, it's a Barbra Streisand vehicle, right? And that's really what it's always going to be. And I don't know how that would have worked. It sounds very strange to me to imagine.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock, and on Instagram at bookedonrockpodcast. The popularity of Beatles films had an impact on Hollywood. The success of 1968's Yellow Submarine, you write, wasn't lost on Disney, which released Fantasia the following year. And in 2009, Disney planned to make a 3D version of Yellow Submarine with Robert Zemeckis. Some of the test footage is online. After his film Mars Needs Moms failed at the box office, Disney scrapped it. Would you have liked to
Wow.
have seen that film completed?
That sounds like it could have been interesting. I mean, Zemeckis is a guy that I have mixed emotions about. I mean, he's certainly a wonderful craftsman. His sort of taste and outlook isn't necessarily something that I want to go and spend 2 hours looking at. But he's a very savvy director, that's for sure.
Is there a Beatles movie you like that you recommend people see?
Well, it's interesting. I talk in the book, obviously. I think all this stuff that we've been talking about, these early rock and roll films, the Chuck Berry, the Alan Freed films, and these performance clips with thin plots. It really the things that changes and makes this whole genre that the book talks about is these two films made in the 60s, one of which is A Hard Day's Night, and the other one is the Dylan film Don't Look Back. I mean, to me, these films are the Adam and Eve of rock and roll movies. All the DNA of all the films that are going to come after it come out of these two films, I think. So this is the moment when it's more. You can go back, and one of the things is, when I write about A Hard Day's Night, every film that I write, I focus on 50 films in depth. But every film I write about has a suggested double feature. And the suggested double feature for A Hard Day's Night is an obscure English film called It's Trad Dad, which was the film Richard Lester, who directed A Hard Day's Night, did right before he did A Hard Day's Night. And it's a little one of these rock and roll exploitation films done British style. The Beatle fans would really find it interesting from the standpoint that the lead actress was a 16-year-old singer named Helen Shapiro, who was the headliner the first time the Beatles toured the UK.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, she's the lead in this film that Richard Lester did. So there's this double Beatles thing because, hey, you got Richard Lester and you got Helen Shapiro. It's a pretty bad film, but you can see what a revolution A Hard Day's Night is by watching the film Richard Lester did before it, for which he was paid £1,000 as the director. I mean, that's what kind of a skinny nothing 2-week films. And A Hard Day's Night itself wasn't a big budget film. I mean, it was made for what was, roughly $500,000 in today's money, that kind of. And it was a very tight schedule. It was literally 90 days from let's make this film to it has to be in theaters. So they sent a writer to go with the Beatles on a short tour of France. And he took notes and came up with the plot of the Beatles dodging their fans and, got a sense of what the interplay and the personality of the Beatles were, and drew it out. And then Lester, encouraged them to improvise, and he's an improviser too, so the film is done quickly, it's done well, and the guy who's really in some ways the hero is the editor of the film, who I'm blanking on his name right now, but the film Zulu?
Yeah,
he had done that was the film he'd done just prior to editing A Hard Day's Night,
okay,
which is a wonderful film.
Yeah,
and well, his whole thing is when he's told, he goes, this film has to be in the studios in the theaters in a couple of weeks. There is no rough cut. Everything you're doing is the final cut. So, and that included the ultimate scene where they perform in the theater, and the Beatles do 4 numbers and there's 500 kids in the theater, and they had 6 cameras, 3 on the Beatles and 3 on the audience. And everything this editor did was the final cut in this all important 10, 15-minute segment at the end of the film.
The 4 Beatles, they were not only kids, but they had never acted before, and they were put in front of a camera.
Well, they were very professional. Brian Epstein did, if he had a great impact, it was in forming the Beatles into sort of a professional crew. I mean, when he first meets them, playing in the cavern in Liverpool, they're playing in leather jackets, and they're sort of tough guys. And in fact, I did a book once about Alan Klein, who had managed both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And as part of it, I had been talking to Andrew Loog Oldham, who was the original Rolling Stones manager, who before he managed the Stones, and a lot of people don't know this, he briefly worked as a publicist for the Beatles. Brian Epstein was in Liverpool. So whenever the Beatles had business in London, Andrew Loog Oldham was the guy who took them around and handled publicity. And he said, it's so ironic because the Rolling Stones are the bad boys. He goes, the Beatles were really tough. He goes, they were 4 poor kids. But he said, George Harrison lived on like the worst block in Liverpool. And he said they were tough guys and they came to town to make money and to make it.
By the way, the Zulu movie, I see it was directed by Cy Enfield. Is
well,
that
no, let me look it up because what I'm thinking of is it's the editor who handled it.
John Jimson. John Jimson?
Yeah. Yes, John Jimson. That's correct.
Fred Goodman is our guest to talk about his book, Rock on Film, which is out now. There have been many Beatles-inspired films over the years, as recently as 2019's Yesterday, which I enjoyed. Are there any that stand out for you?
Yeah, it's a nice film.
Yeah, any stand out?
I think that's a nice film. And the one that really stands out for me is a film called The Hours and the Times, which is a pretty obscure film. It's based on a real incident, which is that in 1964, John Lennon and Brian Epstein went together on a sort of long weekend in Barcelona, just the two of them. And, it's an early queer cinema film that posits the possibility that they had a sexual relationship. And it never decides one way or the other. But it really focuses in on their personalities, what they saw in each other, because, it's clear from what people have said that Epstein, had a sort of special interest in Lennon. He thought Lennon was the guy, and it was, initially Lennon's band. So there is this sort of tension, about them, and it's really fascinating. And its film is mostly based on an Ingmar Bergman film called The Silence. And there's even a scene in the movie where they're in Barcelona and they go to the art theater in Barcelona to see The Silence. So it's very, very unusual. And the film was made on a shoestring, like $20,000, and filmed, over like a week in Barcelona and some scenes in London. And then the director went and spent a year working and raising money and editing the film. And it's a little over an hour, and it's a really thoughtful, really different kind of film. I think, if people knew about it, they'd find it really interesting.
I got to check that one out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, so there are some movies that...
It's been shown on TCM, by the way.
It's been shown on, TCM.
Yep.
Now, some movies on paper, you'd think, this is going to be a hit. 1978 Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. You think that's going to work, right? You got Peter Frampton, the Bee Gees, Steve Martin, Aerosmith. Big name musicians in there and actors too. Robert Stigwood produced that film. What happened? Why did that fail?
Well, I mean, don't forget, Robert Stigwood was coming off of two huge hits, right? Saturday Night Fever and Grease, which completely remade the record business too, as well as, being enormous box office. I mean, those soundtracks were just unbelievably enormous. They were selling 20 million copies at a time when, a huge record was 3 or 4 million copies. So they were phenomenons, especially the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. And it's amazing because that film, the Sgt. Pepper's film, it just doesn't work. I mean, it's complete overkill. I mean, the New York Times said, this isn't a movie, it's a business deal, set the music. And it really doesn't have anything going for it. I mean, that's the weird thing. It's just a terrible mishmash.
Outside of the soundtrack, Aerosmith, I think their cover of Come Together was a hit.
Well, yeah, but you're talking about a double album and you're remembering one track.
I know.
I mean, look at it this way. You have Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees in this film, arguably the two biggest recording artists at the moment. And the film almost killed their careers.
Yeah.
It was a disaster.
There are some that are just comically bad, like I think of Kiss meets The Phantom of the Park, that are just so bad they're fun to watch.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a whole kitschy sort of thing that you can do, to find like what's the worst rock and roll movie?
Yeah,
and there are a lot of the worst rock. And roll
that's the Plan 9 from outer space.
Exactly right.
Equivalent of a rock and roll film. But I want to steer now towards documentaries. 1978's The Last Waltz, directed by Martin Scorsese. Right. The Woodstock documentary in 1970, another one. When do we first see the rock and roll documentary film? What's the first one?
Probably the first real rock and roll documentary, I would say, is Don't Look Back. But you have to go back a little bit further and take a look at things like Murray Lerner's festival film, which was about the Newport Folk Festival, and Jazz on a Summer's Day. These were sort of the way that music was filmed for an intelligent audience. And you see it in the Monterey Pop film, which is directed by D.A. Pennebaker, who also did Don't Look Back. And those are tremendously influential films. So I think it's really kind of late. I mean, no one's taken rock and roll seriously enough to make documentaries about it until Don't Look Back, really.
The Woodstock documentary is interesting in that it really mythologized the event. You talk about the 3 Woodstocks. in your book. What are the 3 Woodstocks?
Well, I said that there were 3 Woodstocks. The Woodstock that happened on stage, the Woodstock that happened in the crowd, and the Woodstock that happened in our imagination. And of course, the film defines that last one by documenting the first 2 in the way that it does. It's, I think, a really good, and I still can watch that film with no problem, even the director's cut at 4 hours, because A, the performance is great, and, B, the editing is good. I mean, Thelma Schoonmaker, edited that film and was nominated for an Academy Award. As people may know, it was directed by a guy named Michael Wadley, who was sort of an outlier in the film business. He only made one other film that had a studio release, and that was Wolfen, which was sort of a weird mashup of a police procedural and a horror movie. And he's always been sort of an outsider. But he went to NYU Film School, and he took his classmate Martin Scorsese with him, who worked as a cameraman and assistant director, and introduced him to, or he knew, I don't know if they introduced or they knew each other from NYU, this woman, Thelma Schoonmaker, who edited Woodstock, and then proceeded to edit, I think, virtually all of Scorsese's films. She's won 3 Academy Awards for editing Scorsese films.
Grateful Dead, are they in that director's cut?
They're not in Woodstock because, well,
but the director's cut, it's in there, right?
It's not even in the director's cut. It's not even
in there because they had such a terrible performance.
Also
stage sank in the mud.
Well, Wadley didn't like them either. He was a dead hater. So, the one that I'd be really curious, and I know I'm in a small group, is the English band, the Incredible String Band, which was at Woodstock, and that film has never shown up. I guess the band performance is reputed to not be very good. That's not in the film. What I didn't realize until I started doing this book, there's the famous Crosby, Stills, and Nash segment. There was a set with Neil Young, but he wouldn't give permission, for his performance to be in the film.
Yeah, that's Neil.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Neil Young. But the Dead, they just had bad luck with that stuff. Like they were at the Altamont shows as well, right? That was
I don't think they went on at Altamont.
They didn't go.
I think they didn't. I don't think they went on.
They got spooked.
They left.
Yeah. They got spooked by the environment, the atmosphere, and that leads to 1970s Gimme Shelter documentary chronicling the last few weeks.
By the way, the band that's at all 3, the band that's at Altamont, Monterey Pop, and Woodstock is the Jefferson Airplane.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting piece of trivia.
Yeah. And Grace Slick has a wonderful quote where she says something like, Woodstock was about the weather, Altamont was about death, and the only one that was about music was Monterey.
Gimme Shelter documentary I want to ask you about, and that documented the Stones' 69 U.S. tour, the last few weeks of it. And you write that a triumph of this film is that there is no mythology here. Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah. Like D.A. Pennebaker, this film was directed by the Maisel brothers, who were part of what was known as the direct cinema movement. They were documentarians, as was Charlotte Zwerin, who edited Gimme Shelter. And their whole thing was they tried to be very unobtrusive. You see it and Don't Look Back. You see it in spades in Gimme Shelter, which is they have nothing to say about what's happening. They're very much trying to just stand back and watch. They're really, usually as a writer, of course, you're aware of that a narrative is necessary on some level, right? And you're trying to stand back in this situation and yet have a narrative emerge. And their whole thing is to the point where I comment that when at the very end, the film, part of it is about trying to figure out what happened at Altamont, because they start, at a Madison Square Garden concert, and they go and you go with them to Muscle Shoals, where they're recording some of Sticky Fingers, and you see them on the road. And then it goes to Altamont where this horrible murder happens. And it's just a madhouse, the whole thing. And you don't even know at the end. They're watching it on the screen. They're playing it back and forth on the editing bay, trying to figure out what happened. And no one comments. And when Mick Jagger stands up at the end of the film, he's upset. But you don't know why. Is he upset over somebody getting killed? Or is he worrying about how this is going to come back and hurt the band? There's just no way to tell what he's thinking. And it's fascinating.
Yeah.
You're really asking the viewer to supply meaning to these films. And that is a great thing. I mean, one of the films I love, and I talk a little bit about this in comparison to other films is the film Patton. The thing I love about that film is that the script that was co-written by Francis Ford Coppola and won an Academy Award requires the viewer it's like a Rorschach test. The viewer gets to decide whether he thinks George Patton was a brilliant general and a great hero or a lunatic. And it's a Rorschach test. And those films that ask the viewer to come in and make up his own mind frequently are the ones that fascinate me. It's not just like, wow, isn't this artist great? You should buy more of his records.
Yeah.
It digs deeper.
1984 Stop Making Sense is hailed as one of the greatest music performance films of all time. Jonathan Demme was the director, and he saw the Talking Heads perform in Los Angeles, wanted to recreate the experience on film. How much do you credit Demme, and how much to David Byrne and the band, who, as Demme said himself, put on a show that was like seeing a movie?
Well, clearly it's a meeting of the minds. The band financed the film. The film was bankrolled by Talking Heads. So obviously they had a lot to say about the direction of it. But, Demme's the right guy for the job, obviously. And his whole vision, which is that post-MTV vision, right? I mean, one of the things that happens is, Woodstock is tremendously mythologizing the music and the scene. And, it's all, wow, isn't this great? And it isn't until MTV comes along that it's more sort of presented in an earnest showbiz way. And this is capitalized in a serious way by the Talking Heads. I mean, it's what's the visualization that we're going to do? How is this presentation going to somehow interact or heighten the music? And you get to see that development in it and the sense of drama that's inherent in a performance.
This is the first time we see David Byrne in the big suit in this film, right? Is
Yes.
that what we?
Yeah.
David Byrne.
It's a wonderful film. I mean, it's not very long, but just the way it's done, starting with Byrne solo on the stage, building in, people walk on the stage, the band gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The music gets more, I wouldn't say complex, but it certainly gets more interactive because it's got a lot more moving pieces. So, it's like going to a concert. That's all it is. But it's fantastic. And in some ways, it was quite radical.
Oliver Stone's movie on The Doors came up just a few weeks ago, and I watched it again. What do you think of that movie?
Well, it's not one of my favorites. I just like to leave it there. I mean, I've seen films with Val Kilmer that I like. That's not one of them. And part of it is maybe being a fan of The Doors and not really feeling the vibe.
In 2000, we get Cameron Crowe's coming-of-age classic, Almost Famous. You being a longtime rock journalist, editor at Rolling Stone, I'm really interested in what you thought of the film when you first saw it. What was your first impression?
Well, I put off seeing it for a while. I have to say that I didn't like Jerry Maguire, which was Cameron's sort of big commercial breakthrough. And a musician said to me, no, I said, I didn't like Jerry Maguire. And he said to me, I hated Jerry Maguire. He said, but you got to see Almost Famous. And he was absolutely right. It really captures the time in a beautiful way. And, for me as a writer, I thought he dealt with some of the issues. There's this whole sort of dance that goes on where you would meet a rock and roll star that you're profiling, and they're being very nice to you because you're writing about them. So the whole thing is like, okay, you're supposed to be there and get the hard truth, right? So what's it going to be? Are you going to be the seducer or the seduced? And Cameron really deals with that in a very open-handed but non-judgmental way. I mean, the film is really, I think, generous. It's a lovely film. And one of the things that really moved me in Almost Famous is the early scene in which he's like 12 or 14 or, whatever he's supposed to be. And his sister is leaving home, and he's got this overbearing mother, and he's like the fish out of water. He's been promoted a couple of grades. He's a little guy. He doesn't fit in. And his sister says to him, look under your bed. And she's left him her record collection. And what it is, of course, is it's a way to look at the world. it's a secret language, when you start listening to rock and roll, you're trying to figure out, wow, what is in this stuff? And, I had made a joke in one of my earliest books that, like, when you first met somebody when I was in college, the first thing you did was look through their record collection.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Because then you'd know what they liked
Exactly.
and what kind of person they were, and that kind of thing. So it's very much that. It's like the language we speak to each other is about music. So that's one of the beauties of this film, is that it's about rock and roll as a way of being, of a way of looking at the world, of a consciousness. And that's what I loved. It really caught me.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Cameron Crowe gave you some great quotes. One of them, the better the song is, the tougher it is to marry to cinema. And that came in response to your question regarding working with songs. How does the music affect what we see visually? And does Cameron make a conscious effort to shape a film or a scene after a particular recording?
No, he gets a feeling, I think. It varies. It's a question I asked different directors. Jim Jarmusch had a much more direct answer. Jim Jarmusch said, yes, I'll play a record and try and figure out how to get the feeling of that record on the screen. And if you see the film that made him, Stranger Than Paradise, the Screamin' Jay Hawkins record, I Put a Spell on You, is key to that film. I mean, it's like another character in the movie, and it's kind of amazing the way he did that. But when I was talking to Cameron, I think Cameron draws inspiration from music, and he also keeps playlists in his head of tunes that he wants to find ways to use in movies. Like he said to me when he was doing Jerry Maguire, it makes great use of Shelter from the Storm by Bob Dylan. He said, oh yeah, Bob Dylan, Shelter from the Storm, get in the game. It's like you have these songs sitting on the bench, he said, and you pull them out when it's appropriate.
He had difficulty getting the Zeppelin song, I would think, right? Because Plant and Page were not that generous with their songs in use of movies, from what I recall.
I don't know. It's a funny thing because every band has a different thing about it. And there's all kinds of crazy horror stories, about trying to get rights for films or that kind of thing. I mean, again, when I did this book on Alan Klein, he was very guarded about using the Rolling Stones music. Like, for example, he would license it for use in the movie, right? Like, I think The Big Chill has You Can't Always Get What You Want in the movie, but not on the soundtrack. Klein was like, okay, if we want to use it and you want to license it, for a fair price in the movie, we can work something out. But the only place you will be able to buy a copy of You Can't Always Get What You Want will be on a Rolling Stones album.
Yeah, that's
so it varies. Similarly, when Easy Rider was made, right? The band allowed the use of The Weight, right, in the film. But on the soundtrack album, it's a cover by the band Smith, or Bob Dylan would not do the film, right? So you have Roger McGuinn doing, It's All Right, Mom.
Right, so that cuts the rate down. They still have to pay the publisher, but
well,
not
they
as
have to
much.
pay. But Dylan refused to lease his own recording for the film,
Yeah.
or his manager, or whatever, So it just varies from person to person, film to film, who gets permission, who doesn't. Like the story about Neil Young not being willing to do Woodstock.
That's the Way was
And
the
yet- and
Zeppelin
yet
song,
he's-
by the way, in Almost Famous, which I love. That's the Way from Zeppelin 3.
Mhm.
Jim Jarmusch, he had an interesting comment regarding his 1995 film Dead Man starring Johnny Depp. Neil Young was a huge catalyst while writing the script.
Well, he had spoken to Neil about doing the music, and Neil agreed to do it. And what's so fascinating is that Neil Young wound up composing, and doing the soundtrack basically live in the studio to a rough cut, which kind of tied Jim's hands then for what he could do, because he would lose the continuity and the flow of the soundtrack. But he said, miraculously, it pretty much worked.
Did you ever hear the story about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? The director of that film crystallized the plot and finished the script by listening to Elton John's Yellow Brick Road. I mean, I never thought about it. I thought, I guess that is a pretty dark album, but he said, I'm trying to remember the director of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But yeah, that was
Tobe Hooper.
Yeah. And he talked about it in interviews. But, this is making me thinking now, is it even possible to make a good biopic film without having the rights to the music? I don't think it's possible.
Well, I don't think you would. Why? How could you?
They tried with the Hendrix. What was the Hendrix film they made with? It was the musician that played him, and they didn't have the rights to his music, and it was like generic sounding.
It's not satisfying. I mean, why would you go ahead and? I mean, you could do it, but why would you?
Right,
is kind of the question. So that gets you into the thorny problem of like, okay, you have to work with the artists. There was that whole great thing that goes on in the making of the Buddy Holly film, the Buddy Holly story, which was controlled by his widow, Maria Elena Holly. And the Crickets, who were his backup band, they had their own publicity rights and they refused to let it be used in the film. So instead, there were fictional backup guys rather than the Crickets.
Oh, wow.
So you get these sort of weird mishmashes in trying to get these films done.
What a performance by
Gary Busey.
Gary Busey.
It's really good. It's it's hard to believe. Again, it's like, wow, he's really convincing.
Yeah, he was Buddy Holly. What's the other one? Who's the one
talking about La Bamba or
not La Bamba? But I'm thinking now the other one was Dennis Quaid.
Oh, as Jerry Lee Lewis.
As Jerry Lee Lewis.
Fired.
He did a good job on that one.
Yeah, he did. And that's a bigger Hollywood film than these other ones in some ways. Quaid was up and coming, but you've got like a good cast, and it feels like it's made with a little bit more money to it than these other films were. Both La Bamba and the Buddy Holly story, I think, are among the very best of the rock biopics.
You lead your conversation with director Penelope Spheris, who directed the Decline of Western Civilization trilogy and Wayne's World. Her quote was, "People
and the Little Rascals."
Oh, really? The one in the 90s, the Little Rascals. Okay. Yeah. Her quote was, "People that make movies generally do not understand music." Sadly, she says people at the studios have no idea of the importance of music and how to use it. Were you surprised to hear that?
No.
You didn't even have to think about it.
Penelope's great. I mean, she's a real straight shooter, and she sort of came up hard and she's proud of it. That kind of thing. Very sort of blue collar, took whatever work there was to get. She said that's how I wound up doing. She did one of the films I highlight as a double feature is a film she made called Suburbia, which she did for Roger Corman's company. And it's basically, a teensploitation film, but it's about punk. And it's really interesting because in some ways it's a punk movie, and in some ways it's a Roger Corman film with all kinds of like tawdry things thrown into it, for shock value and, that sort of thing. And it's got almost a vigilante angle to it that makes you think about films like Joe and Walking Tall, even though it's essentially a punk movie. So it's a very weird amalgam. And she's a fascinating person. I mean, I love talking to her, including her in the book.
As somebody who grew up in the 80s, following all those hair bands, she captured that scene in the second film. Yeah. There's that scene where Chris Holmes, the guitarist of Wasp, is in the pool with his mom, sitting poolside, and he's in the pool, and he's just hammered. She talks to all the bands on the Sunset Strip, and they all want to be the next big rock star. She really just captured that whole scene perfectly.
She's really there at the right moment in Los Angeles. The days of the Dollhouse,
Sunset Strip.
And who's playing, and it's really well done.
Ozzy Osbourne making eggs in the kitchen.
That kind of harkens back to another scene in the first film when she's got the guys from the Germs making breakfast.
Yeah,
so it sort of ties up very nicely between the films.
One of the films she says really affected her, Pink Floyd's The Wall. What was your opinion of the film when it came out in 1980? How do you feel it stood up over 40 years later?
I like it now more than I liked it when it came out. It's a film that people really are divided on. It's not, and including the people who made it. I mean, that's one of the most enjoyable things about writing about it is to see that, Alan Parker and Roger Waters and Gerard Scarfe, the artist who did the stuff, feel completely differently about the film, and they were at each other's throats and didn't know what to do. There's a funny story that at the beginning of this essay about The Wall, which is when they debuted The Wall, it was at the Cannes Film Festival. And back then now there's a new Palais in Cannes, but back then it was an old theater, right? And for the con premiere, they got a 70 millimeter print and 2 truckloads full of Pink Floyd equipment. Okay, the sound equipment. And they blasted it in the Palais to the point where paint was apparently coming off the ceiling. Right? That's how loud it was. Roger Ebert, who I think of as a gentlemanly, even-tempered sort of guy, but not a softie, loved it. Thought it was like the greatest rock and roll movie he'd ever seen. Meanwhile, Steven Spielberg is sitting talking to a Warner executive, and at the end of the film, turns to the executive and goes, "What the fuck was that?" And I say frequently the people who made this film sound more like Spielberg than they do like Roger Ebert, because they don't really seem to know what they did.
I had a friend who was not a big rock and roll fan, and we used to go out Saturday nights, and before we were heading out, we were at his house there, and then there was The Wall on the TV. It was on VH1 or whatever, and we were watching a little bit of it. He goes, "Dude, what the fuck is this about?"
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, and yet, I have a line in writing about it where I say, The Wall doesn't so much know its own mind as ramble around in it and make unsettling discoveries in the darker corners,
Yeah.
And it's true, because you think about things like that scene where Pink shaves his eyebrows and things like that, or the scene of like kids going into meat grinders, or some of Scarfa's paintings. They stick with you the way the most grabbing images, from surreal cinema, whether it's Buñuel or Cocteau, I mean, they do stick in your mind just like those images.
That's what they were going for, right?
There's a power in this film.
Right, that's what they're going for, to hit you on that like visceral level, like just
yeah.
You're
I mean,
feeling
does it hang together as a movie? No, but it's got a couple of moments that are pretty memorable, and that's what I come back to with watching The Wall. I can understand if somebody says I don't want to watch it, but there's things to see in it.
Yeah, it's not the beginning, middle, end type of movie that he comes to the conclusion.
Now I got a question for you.
Yeah.
You asked me about 200 Motels. You got a weird or worst experience going to see a rock and roll movie?
Oh, man. I got to think now. What was one? Velvet Goldmine from 98 was bizarre.
Yeah, that's by Todd Haynes, who's a really great director.
Yeah.
And it is, I mean, it's not a film that I particularly cared for, Velvet Goldmine. But he also directed I'm Not There, which is a film I like a great deal and write about in the book, the film about, the sort of different visions of Bob Dylan, where the 6 actors, including Cate Blanchett, play Dylan. I mean, I've seen some stuff. I mean, I think one of the, there's a great mystery over, the Stones film Cocksucker Blues that Robert Frank did.
Yeah.
That was banned. I was like, don't bother. It's really, I didn't, but the worst I had, I lived in Brooklyn, and there was a famous Jimi Hendrix film called Rainbow Bridge, right? That ended, and what it was some sort of like hippie retreat on Hawaii. And it ended with a Hendrix performance, right? So this is back when midnight movies were just getting going. And I went out with a friend of mine to a movie theater out in like Bensonhurst or Bay Ridge. I mean, the end of the world in Brooklyn, and it starts at midnight. And of course I know that this is this hippie stuff and I have to wait to see Hendrix. So for like an hour, it's about guys climbing up a mountain to go meditate. And then it's like about the meditating. And then the movie ended. Apparently the Hendrix performance had been taken out of the movie over a lawsuit. And they just advertised that they were showing Rainbow Bridge. I think the posters had Hendrix's name on it, the original poster and this and that. Man, you should have seen, you never saw so many angry people at 2:30 in the morning in Brooklyn. I mean, it was unbelievable. And of course, the place was locked up tight. Nobody was getting their money back.
I got to say, it might be Kiss meets Phantom of the Park. First time seeing that. Just the jaw dropping. Like, how did they even possibly put this out? Like, why would they not just say...
Well, I mean, look, the whole notion, I think, is that Kiss is sort of a comic book bond, right? I mean, it's, rock and roll is a comic. So why not make a comic book movie?
Man, I mean, it was like, it was on the level of just some high school kids making a home movie in their backyard. It was like that bad.
I wrote about 100 films, but I watched a lot more. So I'd have to say, the film I that was the worst film I saw. There was a Sonny and Cher film called Good Times, directed by William Friedkin, who did The Exorcist.
Oh God, yeah, The Exorcist.
But this was his first film.
Yeah,
and it's just bad. I mean, having nothing really to do with William Friedkin. I mean, it has like no ending. It's just terrible. There's some interesting stuff. I mean, we were talking about Todd Haynes, Velvet Goldmine, and I'm Not There, and he also recently did a Velvet Underground documentary. But a film he made when he was in college is called Superstar: The Karen Carpenter Story, and he did it with Barbie and Ken dolls. And the film was immediately sued out of existence. But if you go digging around on the internet, you can find like grainy, hard to watch, and it's worth seeing.
The VH1 movies, like the movie on Def Leppard and movies like that, you just wish they never made because they're so bad.
Well, they're small films essentially made for fans. I mean, I don't think those films are ambitious the way Bohemian Rhapsody is an ambitious film meant to extend the franchise, right? We're going to get a new generation of fans, and we're going to continue to tour. And, that's kind of, I think, the impetus for a film like Bohemian Rhapsody. Is like, okay, how do we keep the band going? Because albums don't sell anymore. So how do you mount a tour? This is a good way to mount a tour. If you make a film worth watching.
Oh, and it's worked.
But
Brian May and Roger Taylor have really worked hard. John Deacon, the bassist, has checked out. He checked out long ago, but Roger and Brian May, the legacy is important to them.
Yeah, and you take your hat off to that. I mean, they made something worth watching.
Fred Goodman is the author of Rock on Film, which is out now. We sadly lost Olivia Newton-John, and her career soared after starring as Sandy Olsen in 1978's Grease. Where do you place that film on your list of favorite films?
I don't. It's not a film that particularly worked for me. I really stuck with films that would direct rock and roll movies and R&B and rap films, and there are things in here like The Harder They Come, the great reggae film, because I feel that they're really part of, the rock scene and I think of rock and roll as an integrated form of a black music. So these things are related. They might not always be on the same road, but I think the destination is the same. So I feel that works, but Saturday Night Fever to me is too far. I mean, it's got a great soundtrack, but the film is not about rock and roll. And the same with Grease, whatever you say about it. So I didn't go in that direction. I was really trying to deal with what I thought were the essential films that you had to do, plus turn people onto things that maybe have been overlooked, like a film like Ladies and Gentlemen, The Fabulous Stains, which is a film that had no audience the first time it came out, but became sort of an underground cult classic over the years. I think people should know about a film like Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, the film about Ian Dury. It's a wonderful film. Or some of the documentaries, The Black Godfather, which is a film about a record executive, and what his role has been as a promoter of black talent and also of black identity and political sway. It's a really fantastic film. And these are films that I think, if you're interested in rock and roll, you might not know about them, and you should. Or a film like Oil City Confidential, which is a documentary made by Julian Temple, who's made dozens of rock and roll movies. This one's about a band that's not known in the United States very well called Dr. Feelgood, that was very popular in the UK, one of the pub rockers in the UK, and a big influence on Elvis Costello and Graham Parker and Nick Lowe, these guys that came next, the whole Stiff Records crowd. And it's a really fantastic film, and it turns you on to a whole side of rock and roll that you might not know. I mean, I say to Americans, I was like, well, Dr. Feelgood, they're kind of like the English Jay Giles band. They were a great bar band, and they rock hard, and you should check out these films. So you try and get in, the things you have to talk about and the things that maybe haven't gotten the love they should, and then some things that you think are under the surface.
I've got one documentary, The Devil and Daniel Johnston.
Yeah, that's in here, as a recommended double feature.
Yeah.
That's a really fascinating film.
More people are finding
the Wilco documentary.
Oh, Wilco.
The Wilco documentary. Yep. And also, do you know the Nationals film, Mistaken for Strangers?
No.
fascinating documentary made by the brother of the lead singer, who's a guy with issues. So it's a very personal film, and it's really, really worth seeing. So they're out there. And there were some that I didn't know. Cameron Crowe mentioned to me a film about Paul Westerberg, which I had been unaware of, called Feel Me Tremble. So there's a lot to find. I particularly like this film on Bobby Keys, the saxophonist, which is a really sad and upsetting film in some way.
Yeah. What makes a great documentary? Or even more specifically, what makes a great documentary on a band or artist?
Well, I think it's got to have a point of view, first of all. I mean, my own taste is that, I want to see something that I haven't seen. I want to get a perspective on this band that isn't just like, let's give the fans everything, although that can be good. Again, Cameron Crowe made Pearl Jam 20, which is sort of like, if you're a Pearl Jam fan, my wife is a huge Pearl Jam fan. She went nuts when she saw that film. I mean, there are films that are deliver for the fans, I mean, and that can be good. Jim Jarmusch did a film like that about Iggy Pop, Gimme Danger. And those films are really like, he said to me, when we talked about that film, he goes, yeah, I wasn't going to put in about the drugs or about being in a mental institution. It's just going to be sort of a celebration about it. So that can work. The question is it being done with some thought? Are you getting to see something at an angle that you didn't normally see? And does it engage you?
The Last Waltz. What makes that such a brilliant movie? And
what I mean is really,
like film angle, like the way you're shooting, what you're shooting, what you're capturing.
Scorsese had a vision for what to do with that film. And it's really fascinating. I mean, he goes the opposite. Don't forget, he worked on the film Woodstock, right? And what is the big thing to take away from Woodstock? Triple screen, right? Oh, we're going to do these multiple screens and it's going to be exciting. He does none of that. He makes the anti-Woodstock documentary, right? When he gets to make The Last Waltz. Everything is shot in 35 millimeter, very sophisticated use of colored gels. They've got the backdrop is stuff from the San Francisco Opera Company's La Traviata to make Winterland look like a ballroom. And everything is shot in the way. And, my argument in the film is that with the exception, I was a big fan of the band. And it's clear that this is the end of the road. I mean, if you listen to things like, they recently put out an expanded version of Stage Fright that included a complete recording of a concert done on the Stage Fright tour when they were at the Royal Albert Hall. And I got to tell you, that concert of the band blows away The Last Waltz. It's the band just at their absolute height. This is not the band at their absolute height. You can tell they kind of had it, but it's good. It's good. And they've got all these all-stars. They've got Dylan, they've got Muddy Waters, they've got Van Morrison, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, right? None of them put in a performance that you would say is definitive. The only thing that you look at in the performance, you say, this is unbelievable, this is classic, is the one shot with the Staples Singers where they do the wait. It's amazing. I mean, I've argued this point with friends who say, no, the band's really good. But the point is still the same. None of those people did an essential, you go, when they die, they're going to put up their performance on The Last Waltz. They're not going to. It's going to be something else. So,
but we're also getting to know the members of the band because they're throughout.
They're being interviewed and stuff like that. And some of that stuff is interesting. But to me, it's Scorsese who has this vision of how you're going to photograph this thing. And he makes it work. And by the way, if you look at his camera crew that he has like 5 or 6 top-notch cinematographers. Right? Laszlo Kovacs and, this one and that one. I mean, just amazing. The line I use is as camera crews go, this was the 1927 Yankees. I mean, these guys are all heavy hitters. He's loaded to come out and do this film.
It's just great that he's giving rock and roll the respect that it deserves by bringing those guys in. It's the first of what proves to be a long relationship for Scorsese with rock and roll. I mean, first of all, Robbie Robertson does like half a dozen soundtracks for him. They're very close friends. But the other part of it is he does these documentaries. He does the Dylan, the 2-part Dylan for PBS. And then, of course, he did the Stones thing at the Beacon. He did the George Harrison Living in the Material World. And then finally, he did my favorite out of all of them, the Rolling Thunder Review film that he did with Dylan.
where they took the old footage that Dylan had shot for Ronaldo and Clara and recut it and made it into this fictionalized documentary with actors, where they make up stories and you don't know what's true and what's BS.
Well, thank God he's a rock and roll fan because, yeah, he's done some amazing work.
He's done some great stuff.
We haven't talked about Beware of Mr. Baker as we wind down.
There's a documentary that people should know
2012 came out. Director Jay Bulger lived with the legendary Cream drummer Jack Bruce in South Africa, where he had been living in seclusion. And you write of the film that it is, quote, simultaneously horrifying and sympathetic. The horrifying description, not surprising, but what led you to also describing it as sympathetic?
Well, I mean, this is a guy with real issues. I mean, you can't quite. He's so self-destructive and bitter, and he has no relationship with his family, his wives, his children, none. Yet here's this guy, you see him on a screen, openly getting weepy at the thought that like jazz drummers that he idolizes think he's a good drummer. And it raises all sorts of uncomfortable questions, about artists, right? I mean, you don't want to confuse the art with the artist. But what is it? You go, look at this guy. He's like a terrible human being. He's the first thing that happens in the film is he assaults the director with a cane.
Crazy.
He beats him in the face with the metal handle of his cane.
Bleeding.
Bloodies his nose. Yeah. The guy's nuts, right? I mean, there's something really wrong with him. I mean, and he can't control his own life. And there's this sympathy for this guy who on one level is brilliant at what he does, but you can't be with him. Clapton says, I don't know. He says, I don't know what it is. Compulsion. What's the word? He says, I just would back off when it got scary. And that is a frightening thing to watch, this guy who can't keep it together. I mean, there's one point at which the Cream reunion tour nets him $5 million.
Yeah.
Yet a couple of years later, he's broken. The guy just can't keep it together.
Sad. Credit to Jay Bulger, though, because after he gets assaulted, he kept going.
He did. He got a wonderful movie.
Really?
And here's a guy, it's the first movie he made. I think his background was he was a fashion model.
Wow. Yeah.
Kind of amazing.
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to finish with one last question, which is we did talk about the Queen film and the Elvis one that just came out and the Elton John film. Are you impressed with what you've seen? Do you want to see more of these films? Does it matter?
Not to my taste. When you watch the Queen film, and we talked a little bit about, the notion that, okay, this is a way to introduce and keep the franchise going. That to me is like, it's a piece of product. It's being made to stimulate business, which if it's a good film, that's great. But in my mind, it's hard to get past that. So I'm not crazy about, having Motley Crue being the ones who are telling their story,
Yeah.
Or whoever it is.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and certainly, the Rolling Stones control their image. The Beatles control their image. I mean, that is in some ways what this, Get Back recut was all about. Paul McCartney not liking Let It Be.
Yeah. What did you think of that? Beautifully done.
It's beautifully done, and it's always such a thrill to see the Beatles from another angle.
And you feel like you're there, the way they clean that film up.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so funny, man, because we one thing we did forget, everybody watches that film and goes, wow, we really smoked a lot, didn't we? And it's like nobody smokes cigarettes anymore.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Chesterfield cigarette. My dad and I used to laugh about that. We'd listen to the old radio serials on Sirius XM, and they'd run those commercials. Chesterfield cigarettes, it was like supposed to be good for you.
Oh, yeah, there'd be ads with doctors in the magazines.
Right.
Smoking Camels or something.
Well, this was great.
Crazy.
Fred Goodman.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was a fascinating discussion. And the book is out now, Rock on Film, The Movies That Rock the Big Screen. It's out through Running Press and Hachette Books.
Well, Running Press is part of Hachette. It's one of their imprints. But I'd just again like to thank TCM, because they contributed over 150 photographs and posters to this book.
A beautiful book.
I've never in my career, I've been writing longer than I'd like to say, been able to say, it looks better than I thought it would, but it's a really beautiful book, and I'm grateful to them for it.
It's a must-have. It's one of those books you're going to enjoy reading, but it's also one you could just put down on a coffee table, and it just...
Well, no home should be without it.
Exactly.
And if your house is big,
Yeah.
too.
And you can get it pretty much at the usual places, Amazon, any other places you want to direct people to, any websites or social media pages?
Well, no, TCM sells it too. But,
Okay.
so if you're a TCM person who uses the TCM shop thing, they have the book. But yeah, wherever you like to buy your books.
Fred, thanks so much, man.
Eric, man, it's been great.
This was extra special, as I told you, because of my dad and I's love for Turner Classics. So thank you again.
A pleasure.
And as always, it's been a pleasure bringing you another episode of Booked on Rock. Join me again next time for another brand new episode. I'm Eric Senich.
That's it. It's in the books.